It is a city without water, without access to food, without communications, without power. A city reduced to ruins by constant Russian bombardment. A city which cannot even properly bury its dead. A message from the International Red Cross in Mariupol speaks of an increasingly dire and desperate situation, while President Volodymyr Zelenskyy branded the bomb attack on its maternity hospital yesterday as a war crime. Attempts at humanitarian corridors across Ukraine have again faltered today as several cities remain under bombardment. The mayor of Zhytomyr said that a hospital in his city was hit overnight. Fighting has intensified in the Brovary suburb of Kyiv, and the second city of Kharkiv remains besieged and battered by Russian forces. But it is Mariupol in the south where the situation is the most desperate. And we should warn you again, there are some highly distressing images from the very start of my report. Every day this war brings a new low, and this was today's. The unforgettable sight and sound of a burial in Mariupol. Because of the constant shelling, there is no time or peace for anything more dignified. Remember, 15 days ago, these were all civilians living their lives in this once beautiful port city on the Sea of Azov. Now they're bundled into a hastily dug pit, 70 of them so far. The grim work is performed not by professional grave diggers, but by volunteers from the council, like Volodymyr. Most of them were killed by Russian bombs, but some because they couldn't get urgent medical treatment in a city where the hospitals have been shelled. At about the same time, in an alternative reality, whipped by a stiff breeze. Before talks in Turkey that ended without peace, with his Ukrainian counterpart looking on in despair, Russia's chief diplomat doubled down on his version of the truth. Mr. Lavrov was addressing a home audience that only has access to Moscow's reality. When confronted with yesterday's atrocity at the Mariupol maternity hospital, he had this to say.
В этом родильном доме, мы об этом сказали 7 марта в Совете Безопасности, давно нет ни женщин, ни детей, ни обслуживающего персонала. Его заняли бойцы батальона «Азов», вместе с прочими радикалами устроили там свой опорный пункт. Как они, в общем, делают по всей Украине, превращая людей в живые щиты.
Очень много потерь.
And if Russia didn't attack, what are its tanks doing here on the road at Brovary, only 15 miles northeast of Kyiv? And why are they bunched up like this, sitting targets for an artillery ambush? A cardinal error for which they paid a heavy price. Perhaps this is why the siege of Kyiv hasn't yet taken place. We don't know exactly what happened to the Russian soldiers in these tanks, how many died, how many were taken prisoner. But this is the sort of humiliation that Russian viewers will never get to see. In Kharkiv, a predominantly Russian-speaking city, the siege is well underway, although even here the Ukrainian forces are holding on, and so is 91-year-old Alvitina Shanina. She's too frail to speak or to be moved to the shelter, but in her memory she's living through the last time she endured a siege. The famous siege of Leningrad, when the Nazis were the enemy.
Меня больше всего возмущает то, и появляется нечеловеческая злость от того, что Алевтина Семеновна начинала свою жизнь в блокадном Ленинграде. Девочка голодала, в холоде, в голоде жила, и заканчивает свою жизнь. Там были фашисты, и здесь фашисты, получается, пришли, разбомбили наши дома.
Back in Mariupol under siege, they're queuing for something they once took for granted in another life. Water, now by the bucket. Mariupol in March 2022, reliving a grim and distant past in Europe, that we'd all assumed was buried.
Прямое попадание.
How wrong we were. Well, earlier I met Irina Venediktova, who is the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, and I asked her first whether she was gathering evidence of potential war crimes after the Russian bomb attack on Mariupol's maternity hospital yesterday.
It's not very effective now because, you know, they are still in fighting and our prosecutors is unable to do all procedural acts.
But are you asking local people to collect evidence to send to you?
Absolutely, and some law enforcement agencies do the same on their territory. I am afraid, actually, but if we will wait day, then a week, then months, we can lost. Yes, we can lost a lot of. That's why we
You're
have
afraid
now.
that you lose the evidence if you wait too long, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why we created a hub, warcrimes.gov.ua, and ask all citizens, journalists, NGOs, and other people to work with this platform.
Do you think that Vladimir Putin will ever end up on trial or in the dock anywhere?
I'm sure in it. I'm sure.
You're sure of it?
Yes. If you remember, in history of our great planet was a lot of such cases when people, when they were unpunished, do more and more and more dirty things. Well, now we see a very good example. I don't know why, but our all prominent lawyers and prominent politicians who speak about rule of law every day and in their parliament, from their cabinets and so on, they forgot our newest history. What about Chechnya? What about Syria? What about Donetsk and Lugansk 2014? What about Crimea? Ukrainian
But
Crimea?
none of these crimes have ever ended up in court.
Absolutely. That's why I think this case in Ukraine, this should be stopped. We should stop such situation. We really should do everything, not only Ukrainian prosecutors. We should do it by whole world and stop this aggression and started to punish them. Now we have 5 jurisdictions where prosecutors opened their own criminal case. It is Lithuania, Poland, Estonia, Slovakia and Germany. I hope that we will have more and more jurisdictions.
But is the problem here that the Russians, and you could argue the Chinese as well, perhaps they're best friends now, don't recognize that jurisdiction? There are 2 different sets of law here. The Russians don't recognize the Western set of laws.
That's why we need to win. We need to win. We Ukrainians need to be
on
alive.
The battlefield.
Absolutely. You know, I'm now not emotional. I'm absolutely cold with my words, but if we just will speak about this day after day, every hour, we have new deaths here in Ukraine. You've heard today that Mr. Lavrov, who spoke about yesterday case in Mariupol, in maternity hospital, and he told, yes, we knew about this, but it's not true. It's not about women and unborn children. It's about national troops. It's a huge lie.
Yeah.
It's a huge propaganda. And of course, we need at first stop this war. And after that, I think that every war criminal will be in the court.
Are you meeting with other jurisdictions, like the Americans, for instance, and sharing information?
I speak with American colleagues, with European colleagues, with all other colleagues to start their own criminal cases, because more than 2 million Ukrainians now are refugees, and every day it's more and more. And from other side, it's very important to freeze all assets and properties of these criminals. They are still suspects, but we understand when we will have court decision. After this, we want confiscate their property to the budget of Ukraine for rebuilding our country. It should be very fast, because such steps will stop this aggressor and they maybe will think about their activity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, more than half the population of the capital, Kyiv, almost 2 million people, have now fled the city. That's according to its mayor. Surrounded by tank traps and checkpoints manned by armed volunteers, the Ukrainian capital has been turned into a fortress. Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, is in that fortress. Lindsay.
Matt, fortress it may be, but driving up from the south, I was rather surprised at how relaxed the territorial defence forces of the Ukrainians remain. We were waved through the checkpoints. There wasn't too much trouble. So that suggests that the south of the city is at the moment all right. It's a very different picture in the northeast and the northwest. There you've got the Russians in this pincer movement, which may be stalled, but they are still there, and there has been fighting. It's worth looking at that footage which you showed again, because you can see then that the Russian tank column, the Ukrainians take out the tank at the back, and then they take out the tank at the front. Now, what does this show us? People who know more about this than I do say it could have been artillery, or it could have been the kind of anti-tank weapons that both the British and the Americans have given the Ukrainian military. It's extremely precise, and it's targeted exactly where it needs to be targeted to disable that column. Now, I don't know whether the Americans or British or whoever are giving advice, or the Ukrainians are doing this all alone. Whichever it is, it shows that although the Russians do have a much superior force, what the Ukrainians have, they're using very well. Whether that's enough, I don't know, but it certainly shows how they're able to stop the Russians at the moment on these axes coming into Kyiv.
Well, I guess we're going to find out in the next few weeks. What about the human cost in the capital, especially with all these people leaving?
The human cost is pretty terrible. And we saw again today how people are fleeing from Irpin. That's in the northwest, and that is where the fighting and the human cost has been at its most terrible. You've obviously also got what you've been talking about, which is Mariupol. Now, we know from Syria that this is not collateral damage. This is part of the Russian doctrine of war. Attacks on civilians are part of how they try to win. The World Health Organization has said that 18 health facilities have been attacked so far, 2 of them yesterday in the Kyiv area. What that makes me think of is that how President Putin has said that he's here to save the people of Ukraine, that Ukrainians are the brothers of Russians, in fact, just like Russians, and yet he is attacking these people. It makes me think of, you remember that bitter phrase from Vietnam, in order to save the village, we had to destroy the village. Maybe that's what President Putin is thinking. In order to save the people of Ukraine, we have to kill them.
Lindsay, thanks very much. Look after yourself. Well, Putin's war is a defining moment for Europe. EU leaders were told as they met in the Palace of Versailles, site of another defining moment for Europe after World War I. The host, Emmanuel Macron, said that talks on Ukraine joining the European Union couldn't start while the country was at war. The foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine did meet in Turkey today, but without any progress towards any ceasefire. And we should warn you, there are distressing images in this report by Jonathan Rugman.
Russia's bombardment of Mariupol today left this boy trapped but still alive. In a city where local officials claim well over 1,000 people have been killed. Yet from President Putin this afternoon, there was no word of regret, railing against Western sanctions instead.
These sanctions would have been imposed anyway. There are some questions and problems and difficulties, but we have overcome them in the past, and we will overcome them now.
His foreign minister was hosted by Turkey today, but without his boss's say-so, Sergei Lavrov can't negotiate anything. Though there was this suggestion that toppling Ukraine's leader is not an objective anymore.
We
confirmed today that President Putin doesn't reject meeting President Zelenskyy. I hope such a necessity will arise, and we will need to prepare for this.
Still, the distance is immense. The Russians don't believe Ukraine's claim that it won't try to join NATO, while the Ukrainians say that Russia doesn't want a ceasefire yet.
They seek a surrender from Ukraine, but this is not what they are going to get. Ukraine is strong, Ukraine is fighting, Ukraine made Russian initial plans fail.
President Putin's forces seem most focused on the area in pink that they occupy in southeastern Ukraine. By bombing the city of Mariupol into submission, the Russian leader could create a coastal strip he can resupply from the Black Sea, joining up Crimea, which he annexed in 2014, with the Donbass region, which he might annex next. And keeping these territories might be the bare minimum Mr. Putin can call victory. President Macron of France spoke to the Russian leader today and says he will again soon. The French are hosting an EU summit in Versailles, where a peace agreement officially ended the First World War. But lest we forget, that took more than 4 years.
I have to confess that today the conditions it put on the table are not acceptable by anybody, to be honest. So the question is Mr. Putin ready to re-engage honestly and propose something, and we will work genuinely.
Ukraine applied to join this EU club last week, while the Russians insist it cannot. And the fear is that this war is so existential for Russia's leader that he cannot end it until more of his demands are met.
Now, Boris Johnson has echoed fears from American officials that Russia could use chemical weapons in Ukraine, saying it was straight out of their playbook. Defense experts are worried that Vladimir Putin could ramp up the scale of his attacks, saying that so far the Russian military has become bogged down by an ill-conceived plan, morale issues and considerable logistical issues. Here's Paul McNamara.
Overwhelming force is part of Russian military doctrine, but overwhelming force relies on overwhelming logistics, and there is evidence that as this war drags on, Russia's having problems. This is a Russian air defense system, but what's interesting here isn't the expensive rockets on top, it's the cheap flat tires below. These are really pricey and need a lot of maintenance at any time, let alone to deal with Ukraine right now, which is really boggy as winter snow melts. Underneath them is a complex system that constantly pumps air into the tires. But without maintenance and in a bog, if this system holds up, it's pumping air into poor quality Chinese tires, and tires which can apparently decay over time in direct sunlight if they're left static before the war, rendering them, well, effectively rendering them useless, says one expert who spent a decade looking after these for the US Army. And it's probably indicative of wider problems.
If you're not taking care of a 20 million pound air defense truck, you're not taking care of a normal truck.
It's not trucks, though, but trains, which Russia is uniquely expert in utilizing for the military. And on Wednesday, the Russian Ministry of Defense provided these pictures of an armored train in the southern city of Mariupol. There for humanitarian reasons, they say. It's logistical reasons, say watchers in the West.
It's all about trains now. The Russians have got to get the railways, and the Ukrainians hold the cities on the eastern borders. The Russians have got to project power from Crimea through the ports there and through the railways into central and Ukraine. And that is where the war in the coming weeks will be focused.
In war, momentum, both literal and psychological, helps. In recent days, Russian advances have stalled. The unknown now, are these failures so far terminal or merely just slowing them down?
Paul McNamara. Now the Chancellor is facing a bill running into tens of billions of pounds if he wants to shield British households and public services from the massive spike in inflation that's been exacerbated by the Ukraine conflict. Rishi Sunak is under growing pressure to act in his spring statement, due in just 2 weeks. Our economics correspondent Helia Ebrahimi is with me. Helia.
Chris, rewinding just to last month, and we were told higher inflation would cost ordinary people an extra £18 billion in their annual energy bills. Rishi Sunak stepped in with a £9 billion rescue package. But now, with the war in Ukraine, inflation is going to go above 8%, and we're expecting it to last much longer, meaning that there's an eye-watering £43 billion extra we're going to pay in our annual bills. Now, that starts to make Rishi Sunak's rescue package look a bit paltry. If he wants to shield half of that, he's going to have to come up with an additional £12.5 billion.
So what are the pressures the public going to be under?
Well, there's an increasingly long, very serious list of financial problems he faces, including welfare payments not keeping up with inflation, the very real terms cut facing public sector workers. But let's talk about defence spending, because in the UK, defence spending has been falling since 1955. Here it is against health spending, and you can see they've overtaken, and health spending has gone up to £164 billion, whereas defence spending has fallen back down to £42 billion. Now, clearly that benign world, Krish, is over, and there are going to have to be some very difficult decisions about whether we have cuts in other places or whether we have higher taxation. And don't forget, this Tory Chancellor has already taken the size of the state to a 70-year high.
OK, so how can they afford to spend more on things like defence?
It's very hard, and it's very difficult for the Chancellor because the fiscal decisions he faces now are going to be tougher, potentially, than the ones faced even in the pandemic. You know, there are some serious questions about how long consumers will be able to cope and how much governments will have to step in to help them in the UK, but everywhere in the world. Now, I don't think all of these decisions will be resolved in the spring statement. For example, on energy, they're likely to wait until the October price cap to do anything. But be in no doubt, Putin's big financial weapon is global inflation. Take a look, for example, at this depressing chart. This is the forecast for UK growth and how it's been dragged back first from October to November to February. And that last bar in both years, the blue one, is taking into account the Ukraine crisis. Now, those are really serious reductions, made even clearer when you look at historical averages. And we're falling far short of that. And, Krish, it's going to take a long time before we get back there.